We've always eaten lots of meat, and we can tell that very clearly, and we're basically effectively super carnivores.
The idea that we've been eating lots of meat for a long time is, I think, very much academically up in play. You just got to read the most recent literature and not just go with hearsay.
All of those tools that you hear about, Stone Age tools, those were not tools. Without exception, they were weapons. They were used to hunt animals and cut them up so we could eat them.
I prefer lower saturated fat diets in my heart clinic patients because I think the literature overwhelmingly supports that. So there's Dr. Ancel Keys in a nutshell. Is he the greatest scientist in the world? I don't know, but is he the devil? He's definitely not the devil.
So would it be safe to say that a huge reason that you believe that high saturated fat is harmful to a human for, let's just say, all cause more mortality and other things too, is due to the research done by Ancel Keys? Would you credit a lot of that? Okay, so I personally find that a lot of the disagreements between, let's say, a carnivore or an animal-based or meat-based community, or people who subscribe to that lifestyle, I should say, versus people who do not, let's say vegan or plant-based, I find that it's almost impossible to move forward without coming to an agreement on the kind of research that's been done and the foundation of our knowledge. So, Dr. Khan, a lot of people in the carnivore or the meat-based lifestyle realm really fundamentally believe that Ancel Keys did a terrible thing with his study and lied about data that is not only just not good to lie, but it has created an entire ripple effect in terms of our medicine and how we understand medicine. So that's been a huge factor that I think without understanding that one area and getting on the same page with it, it's hard to move forward. So I know that you've had a history, Dr. Khan, with studying Ancel Keys. Would you mind sharing what you've done with his research and then your standpoint on that? And then I'd love to hear the same from you, Dr. Berry.
Sure. When I was in medical school, which is over 40 years ago, I never heard the name, Ancel Keys. But I got interested just out of a natural curiosity. And I got a feeling Dr. Berry is naturally curious. Who was this man that his name pops up, fairly frequently, certainly in the world of cholesterol and dietary saturated fat and future health guidelines, and predominantly the Mediterranean diet. So totally voluntarily, I read almost all 300 of his peer-reviewed published papers and a very long, really a book called The 7 Country Study, published in 1970. And it's always important to stress, Dr. Ancel Keys never worked alone. He had 18 co-researchers who, in their own right, all over the world, some are still alive because we're talking about research done in the late 50s, 60s, 70s, with a few publications still coming out. But Dr. Keys was always surrounded by some of the brightest epidemiologists, nutritionists, biochemists. His own wife was a biochemist, Margaret. And, the conclusion in a long nutshell was, the example, pretty unknown in America, called the Mediterranean diet. Eat like you're a poor Italian. Many people don't know he ended up living in Minneapolis most of his career. But every winter for 40 years, he had a big home south of Naples in a little town called Piopi. And it's a town of 300 people, but I've visited Piopi. There is a museum to the Mediterranean diet on the Mediterranean Sea. There's a museum to Ancel Keys. His house is still there, although it's privately owned. And from around the world, people would come to Piopi, P-I-O-P-P-I. Now, there is a book written by my friend, Dr. Malhotra, Asim Malhotra, called The Piopi Diet. I don't agree with it because he's basically using this example of a little town of 300 people for the whole world. It's a bit of a stretch, but anyways, it's a bit of a famous tiny town. And he basically promoted to the United States in the 60s and 70s with 3 books that became major bestsellers, recipes and the rationale why chronic diseases that he was seeing in Minneapolis already, heart attacks, diabetes, obesity, dementia, metabolic disorders were exceedingly rare in Italian towns, particularly Naples. And it turns out, 6 other countries, which is why his major tour de force is called the 7-country study. But he died. He was 100.5 years old. I think he died in about 2004, if my memory serves me. Won many awards. I will say, so when I visited his Wikipedia 10 years ago, you would have thought you were reading The Demon. He took money from industry and he distorted it. And the key argument, I want to maybe one more minute, was there is something called the 7-country study. 7 countries, 16 community, 12,000 men spread around the world, very different diets before the era of the internet and computers. And they would send a team of researchers to do EKGs, blood pressures, physical exams, interviews. They'd take their food back to Minneapolis and analyze it for its nutritional content. And the bottom line, he identified that the best health were communities that had a plant-forward diet, that enjoyed olive oil rather than butter, lard, or ghee. That ate a lot of fruits and vegetables and high-fiber diets. And he published correlations between the percentage of saturated fat in the diet. East Finland won the award for the highest saturated fat in the diet and the most coronary heart disease and the highest blood cholesterol level, as opposed to Japan and Yugoslavia that had very low-fat diets and the lowest coronary heart disease rates and better longevity, and published it. But somewhere along the way, I tell you this and then we're done, in 1953, and nobody can take me on this, I'm his biographer. I am Dr. Ancel Keys' biographer. I never met the man. I don't know his family. I have no skin in the game. And he was no vegan. If you read his cookbooks, oh boy, is he far from a vegan. But he taught the Mediterranean diet. He taught in the cookbooks, don't add sugar, don't add sugar, don't add sugar. So Dr. Berry would like the recipes. Actually, they're closer to Dr. Berry's diet than they are to my diet. But he proposed in 1953 from a rather crappy database, FAO, it's a government nutritional database, that this relationship might be true. And he had to pick some countries to propose a hypothesis. And he picked 6 countries out of 22. Why? There were no death records in Mexico. And you can't really comment on food and death if you don't have death records, as one example. 6 countries. And that set up the hypothesis that led him to do this 12-year major study, 1958 through 1970, and then 25-year follow-up from 1970 to 1995. And, if you would have read his Wikipedia, you would read that he, purposely left out some of these data points. The reality is that 1953 study matters not. It was a hypothesis. He went forward like scientists should and did one of the most difficult studies, probably to this date, trying to get nutritional data, kind of like Weston Price. He was just one guy touring the world in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. But Dr. Keys made it a very academic international program. And you can argue that when he introduced the Mediterranean diet, which wasn't a McDonald's diet, it wasn't an Arby's diet, it was planned to be a low sugar diet and was planned to be a high olive oil diet and fruits and vegetables and grains, that he did something nefarious. But fortunately, his Wikipedia has been updated, I think a lot because I wrote his biography. And, it reads like what he deserves as a guy who was doing tough science. He did do a lot of what are called metabolic ward studies. The most careful science, which neither Dr. Berry or I do, is to take 30 people, lock them up for 4 or 8 weeks at the National Institutes of Health, measure every calorie in, every calorie out, every respiration, every metabolic function, and, do an experiment. And, there's over 395 of those metabolic studies that Dr. Keys was one of the participants in. And the correlation between dietary saturated fat and blood cholesterol, because you're not going to measure death rates in 8 weeks, was absolutely a very high correlation, which is why I prefer lower saturated fat diets in my heart clinic patients, because I think the literature overwhelmingly supports that. But so there's Dr. Ancel Keys in a nutshell. Is he the greatest scientist in the world? No, I don't know. But is he the devil? He's definitely not the devil.
Okay. So would it be safe to say that a huge reason that you believe that high saturated fat is harmful to a human for, let's just say, all cause more mortality and other things too, is due to the research done by Ancel Keys? Would you credit a lot of that?
And many others, but his creativity and his persistence, his ability to do this study at times, that was so difficult. But, Dr. Barry and I may not do the same thing. I quote science. British Medical Journal, January 11th, 1997, published, is a dietary lipid and blood cholesterol by Dr. R. Clark. All you got to do is read that 395 metabolic ward studies, the best way you can analyze 4 or 8 weeks. And all you see is higher saturated fat diets, higher blood cholesterol. Now, the next step is to say, I don't believe that blood cholesterol has anything to do with cardiovascular disease, but that puts you out on such a fringe of academic cardiology and academic medicine, and reminding people that statins cost about $4 a month. There's no money in statins. So it's not a money thing to say, let's lower cholesterol anymore. I used to be, but it's not. So anyways, that would be one example. That has nothing to do with Ancel Keys, the reference from Oxford University, January 11, 1997, the British Medical Journal. So yeah, it's that science, it's his science. And really, it's, to my mind, every major study since in the last 4 weeks. There just hasn't been anything that's knocked that off its boat. Dr. Ron Krauss, somebody who's often correlated with paleo, keto, low carb diets. He published in 2017 in a journal called PLOS One, high saturated fat diets, high LDL particle numbers, atherogenic blood profiles, a randomized study. And for Dr. Ronald Krauss to publish that, pretty impressive, because he's associated with, the opposite diet. But in reality, his science spoke to it. So I probably went more than 5 minutes.
That's fine. I think that's a great segue, because Dr. Barry, I know that you have some strong opinions about this, as do a lot of people. There's a lot of just absolute disagreement with what Dr. Kahn just said. And a lot of, I think, confusion too. The belief from people who employ, beef, butter, bacon, eggs, let's say, that saturated fat isn't, with a proper human diet, isn't actually bad for you in the way that research and science has sort of condemned it. So can you help me understand from your perspective, specific to Ancel Keys first, your perception of that research, and then from there, kind of what you've come to find with science as well with saturated fat?
Yeah. Thank you, Lauren. And it's a pleasure to chat with Dr. Kahn officially, virtually in person. He and I are Twitter buddies. We hold a lot of the same beliefs on many things, but just not on diet for human beings. So first of all, several things to unpack. Ancel Keys was a great scientist. There's no doubt about that. He was very diligent. I believe he was mostly earnest. Now, his connections with corporate money, I think they're pretty well documented. But I own many books written by Ancel Keys. So he basically did the groundbreaking research on starvation, and I've got all 3 volumes of his starvation studies on my bookshelf at home, and it's dense reading, but I think it's super important research. The 7 countries study, the 6 countries, 7 countries. He did collect data from 22 countries. And Dr. Kahn said, Mexico, they didn't keep death records, so therefore that knocks them out. You can't really use them. But that's not the only country that Dr. Keys chose to knock out in the final publication. And so you can make of that what you will. But I think he was earnest. I think that he was following a hypothesis that whether he didn't follow that way of eating in his personal life, which he definitely did not. Several quotes of him talking about the joys of bacon for breakfast. But he believed that this hypothesis was true. And instead of trying to disprove that hypothesis, which is actually what a good scientist does, he spent his entire career trying to prove it and pile on. And like many really, really preeminent good researchers, he was a bit on the abrasive side. And that's
Yep.
also well documented, as Dr. Kahn knows. And he was not above berating, belittling, and in some cases, destroying the careers of people who disagreed with him. And so you could see how, if you're a very prominent scientist and you also have that kind of reputation, most people are probably going to just stay quiet when you're talking. And I think he enjoyed a lot of that. When it comes to the studies that Dr. Kahn just quoted, he used a word there that's very, very important. It's very key, correlation. And so anybody who follows me and listens to what I have to say, they know that that immediately means that that was observational research of some kind. There's several different flavors of observational research, but that's what that was. And they also know that you can never prove causation with observational research. You can only suggest a possible association. And then you can also comment on how strong that association seems to be, but you can never prove causation with that. So very early in my medical career, I engulfed all of the modern nutrition research, and I believed it to be the gospel. But then, me, like many other people, we kept getting told, oh, eggs are bad. Oh, wait, eggs are good. Oh, this is bad. Oh, wait, this is good. And so at some point, I was like, if this is the state of the art of science, and I understand, the different studies show different things, but it shouldn't be literal black and white like that. I mean, studies are going to do this, but they're going to generally be pointing in the same direction, not, oh, bad, oh, no, good. And so that's when I thought, it probably matters what humans ate a long time ago. That probably matters a lot. And so I really started to read in the archaeological literature, and then later the anthropological literature, and then later the paleoanthropological literature. And that's when it became self-evident to me, as self-evident as it is to all paleoanthropological researchers, is that from the beginning of our species, about 300,000 years ago, we have eaten as much fatty meat as we could get our hands on that entire time. And so there's this principle in biology. I had my undergraduate in animal biology. So there's this principle called adaptation. And so what that word means in biology is when a species has been doing something for a long damn time, so millions and millions of years, that species has adapted to that. And not only can they tolerate it, they've learned to actually optimize on that. And so when you look at humans, even before we were Homo sapiens sapiens, going back 2 to 2.5 million years, we were eating as much fatty meat as we could get our hands on, as much seafood as we could get our hands on. Anything that ran, swam, flew, we were going to eat it. Now, the case can absolutely be argued that many times we were probably starving to death and we would have eaten rocks if we could have digested them. Yes, totally true. Humans are omnivores. There's no doubt about that. I am not a carnivore zealot and never have been. I advocate a proper human diet, which can range from low carb to keto to ketovore, all the way down to carnivore in some people in some cases. So adaptation, let's take a cow, for example. Cows have been eating grass for millions of years. And so if Ancel Keys or if Dr. Kahn or some of their colleagues in the plant-based world, if they did an observational study on cattle and they said, we've noticed that when cows add some meat into their diet, that the odds ratio is a little bit better for them. Just on its face, to say that cows should eat meat, that's an extraordinary claim. And so you can't even come at me with observational research. You can't come at me with epidemiology. That's not going to cut it, because what you're making is a fantastic claim that cows should eat meat. that's foolishness on its face. And if you're going to argue that position, then you need to have compelling, controlled research that shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that that's true. I don't believe that the plant-based community has that kind of compelling research, but I do know that through stable isotope analysis, we can tell what our ancestors have been eating for 2.5 million years. And it's been lots of meat, whether it's meat that swims or meat that crawls and runs or meat that flies. We've always eaten lots of meat, and we can tell that very clearly. And so if you ask any paleoanthropologist, they're like, well, yeah, we're basically effectively super carnivore. 70% of our food comes from animals, and it has for 2.5 million years. So to say that we should not eat what we've eaten for 2.5 million years is an extraordinary claim that Dr. Kahn is making. And I invite him to give me research compelling enough to convince me that cows should eat meat, or that Homo sapiens sapien should not eat meat. And so I think that on a proper human diet, every single human on planet Earth is going to be healthier by including meat in their diet. I think I'm not making an extraordinary claim. I'm just saying we should keep doing what we've done for 2.5 million years.
Right. Okay. And really quick, Dr. Khan, I just want to say something really quick just to get clarity on this. So just yes, no answers, if you guys could quickly. Dr. Khan, you've been vegan for many years now. Do you eat vegan to be healthier, or because it's a lifestyle choice for you to help animals be happier? Sorry, that's not a yes, no. Do you eat it to be healthier or not necessarily?
4 fundamental reasons. I do it for religious reasons because I honor something called kosher dietary laws. It's very easy to do that. I do it because of I would say 500 to 1 medical science, because there's almost no medical science. There's lots of Twitter, lots of YouTube, lots of Instagram. There's almost no medical science for the carnivore diet and cardiovascular disease, carnivore diet and reduction in cancer. It doesn't exist. I look for it every day. It doesn't exist. 500 times more papers. Just this week, I can quote you 3 or 4 of them, relate a whole food plant-based diet to reduce cancer risk, diabetes risk, dementia risk, and cardiovascular. So I do it for health. I do it for animals. That wasn't the initial incentive. And I do it a lot for the planet, because if 10 billion people eat like Dr. Berry, we're going to be living in an earth full of shit. And if 10 billion people eat like I eat or some modification, we might make it through the growth of the planet in 2050 to 2100. And just got to look at a body of research. I don't want opinion. Let's talk research. Just go look at Eat Lancet, a major effort to look at a diet for the planet that just was published by the Harvard School of Public Health, happens to also reduce cardiovascular risk. So I do it for 4 major pillars. And 47 years later, because that's how long I haven't eaten one speck of an animal product in 47 years. So either I'm a freak, or it works pretty well to eat fruits and vegetables, legumes, whole grains, natural soy products. I like organic. There's a lot Dr. Berry and I agree on. I mean, I've gone through his proper human diet and, the 11 concepts. So nobody wants crap. Nobody wants excess, refined foods, refined sugars. I like fasting. I favor the 5-day fasting mimicking diet. I like minerals. I think people get sugar addicted. I have many patients that are. But the last thing I'll say, this idea that we actually have one ancestral diet is very much up for play. There was a really important study just published a few weeks ago out of a paleo
Pause on that one for me, Dr. Khan. We'll come back to that because I want to keep the really quick. We'll come back to that. It's a good point. Okay. Dr. Berry, I want to ask you, why do you eat carnivore, and have you ever eaten plant-based before, or omnivorous like you were mentioning before?
Yeah, I've been eating low carb for about 11 or 12 years, and then for about 7 or 8 years keto, which is much lower in carbohydrates, and then for the last 5 or so years I've been 99% carnivore. And like I said earlier, I'm not a zealot. If there's some nice roasted Brussels sprouts, I'm going to eat one because they're tasty. But the reason I do this is because for my health, and that's what I thought we were going to talk about was health and nutrition today. So I used to be pre-diabetic and I used to be severely obese. I weighed 297 pounds. I had the worst reflux heartburn you can imagine. I had toenail fungus. I had dandruff. I was a mess. I was
Right.
working full time as an ER doc and full time in my clinic. And obviously, sleep played a part in my metabolic illness, but I was just eating crap. And as soon as I lowered the carbohydrates, cut out the added sugar, excess sugar, cut out the grains, immediately my health started to turn around. And let me be very clear that I am not anti-vegan or anti-plant-based. If somebody wants to eat a vegan diet or plant, well, I don't want to be insensitive, Dr. Khan. Should I say plant-based or should I say is vegan okay? Or because there's
You
so
know,
much vitriol on
generally,
Twitter.
generally doctors use the word whole food plant-based.
Okay, let's use that.
Because we're not talking, fake meat burgers.
Gotcha. Perfect. So if somebody chooses to eat whole food plant-based for ethical reasons, I support them 100%. If they are aware they're going to have to take anywhere from 8 to 12 supplements every day for the rest of their life. If they want to do it for religious reasons, I wholeheartedly support their decision as long as they understand they're going to have to take 8 to 12 supplements a day for the rest of their life. But if they're doing it because they've been misled into believing that has been proven to be the healthiest diet for human beings, I have a problem with that, and that's what I speak out against. I think Dr. Khan will agree that I never bash vegans like some other people in this sphere, and I never intend to do that because vegans are just like carnivores. We're just trying to do the best we can and be as healthy as we can and try to make the best moral decisions that we can. We disagree on a few basic premises, but that doesn't mean that we have to hate each other or bash each other. And I don't see a place for that at all. And that's why I was happy to do this evening with Dr. Khan, because I think he's an honorable gentleman. I think he's earnest. I think he's doing what he believes in and he's promoting what he believes in. And I'm doing the same thing. And I think this kind of discussion, instead of the bashing that we see on social media, is going to go a long way towards helping just regular folks make up their minds.
Right. And I think it's exactly what the goal is here. We're all trying to help people, but let's work together. And let me ask you one follow-up question, both of you, and then I want to move to the next question that will kind of get to some of what we were just touching on there. Dr. Berry, yes or no, do you think high saturated fat, without processed sugar and all the crap, do you think high saturated fat is a bad thing for human beings to consume for their health?
No, not at all. Now, in the context of you're also eating a high carb diet in addition to the lots of saturated fat, that's probably an issue. But saturated fat in the condition it comes to us from in nature, mixed with protein and fat from an animal, that there's no healthier food on planet Earth for human beings.
And when you say a high carb diet, you mean plants, not processed foods. You mean if they combine that with plants that have carbs.
Well, enough plants for some people. And like I mentioned earlier, I went low carb. I lost a little weight, but I still classified as obese, even eating. I was basically vegetarian, and I included very lean poultry, a few occasional lean beef, but I was effectively a vegetarian, and that did improve my health. No doubt about it. I lost weight and my A1C came down a smidge, but I only low carb keto, very meat heavy keto is what reversed all of my metabolic markers back to normal.
Got it. Okay. And Dr. Khan, do you believe that a high saturated fat diet where you're not consuming any, processed foods, anything else, like I just said, is bad for one's health in the short term and the long term?
When you deal with one patient, you have to look at pre and post and try and make this, there's a term personalized medicine. The likelihood that a total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and very ominous inflammatory markers are going to rise significantly is the real deal with high saturated fat diet. I like to talk literature. I already talked about Dr. Clark's metabolic ward studies, because metabolic ward studies are the cleanest studies that scientists have to deal with, because we're locking people up and we're controlling everything. And he published 395 of them, and the saturated fat in the diet and the blood cholesterol were related. And there's no doubt that many people suffer heart attacks, strokes, loss of legs, and death due to high LDL cholesterol. Now, the problem is there are some people that don't. It doesn't shake the entire lipid hypothesis. There are other factors, the health of their endothelium, cofactors like their genetics and their homocysteine and their insulin resistance for sure. But yes, I do believe that. I had a patient, and I don't like N-1 studies because I don't have any personal study. I've been healthy since age 18 when I started a whole food plant-based, and 47 years later, I'm still healthy. So I can't tell you about my health. It's been incredibly good, and I attribute a lot of that, not to genetics, because genetically I have disease in my family. But I saw a patient just Thursday, 2 days ago, and he came in sheepishly because I had already sent him his labs. His total cholesterol was about 380, and previously it was 250. And I said, what happened? He was on no medication, and he's had a calcium score 0, and he's had carotid studies. So I monitor him very carefully. I don't put everybody on statins for a number on paper. I monitor the blood vessels. And he goes, my wife went on a carnivore diet at the advice of a very good nutritionist, and to be loving and supportive for 8 weeks, I went on a carnivore diet. And yes, my cholesterol went from 250 to 400. And, maybe he's about 56. Maybe he'll be an 80-year-old man with a cholesterol 400, but he chose to give up on that. That's what you see commonly with a high saturated fat diet. And he had a clean high saturated fat diet. The bottom line is, if anybody listening to this is doing a carnivore, a ketovore, a paleo, high meat and saturated fat diet, just do your blood work at a minimum. Do it before, do it after. Make sure you know the consequences. And I'm totally familiar with Dave Feldman and lean mass hyperresponder, research, which I would say is in its infancy. But, you're also talking about 70 years of overwhelming data that many people will have a stroke, a heart attack, or die, predominantly due to high saturated fat in the diet and its impact on LDL cholesterol.
Okay. So clearly very different opinions on that one. I think what's interesting about this is that so many people in the carnivore space actually don't look at high cholesterol really as the marker of bad health. They actually see it as the science is wrong. It's kind of like blaming the fireman for the fire, where obviously people in a whole foods plant-based lifestyle do not see it that way. So it's interesting because what we're talking about is like science, right? How do we understand this? We do it through data, right? Data is collected. Well, some of the problem that I think we run into for both parties having accurate data is transparently there hasn't been a lot of research done on a carnivore lifestyle without processed foods, right? Or just not processed meats. And so I think a lot of people watching this will want me to say that and acknowledge that, because that is the reality. It's not been funded. And why hasn't it been funded? Well, a lot of people haven't been backing it with money. And a lot of people question that because they think that's on purpose, or that's at least not an accident. So something that I wanted to ask to follow up on everything was, obviously there is a cost to everything. Everything has a cost, literally. What I kind of wanted to dive into, if both of you have an example, was a science-backed case or some data that you have from, let's say, a long-term carnivore that went plant-based and what results they saw in terms of health. And then maybe the opposite, a long-term whole foods plant-based person that went carnivore and the results that they're seeing. Now, again, you don't need to do this in just one little anecdote. Yes, that's good. And I would love to hear some of that. But big picture, really what's happening in numbers, right, that we're seeing. So why don't we start with you, Dr. Barry? What are you seeing? Are you seeing people going from whole foods plant-based to carnivore? and what results are you seeing? And tell us a bit about that, please.
So I'm a primary care doctor. I'm a family physician. And so I look for signal. And I suspect Dr. Kahn looks for signal in his practice as well. If there's a new medication that comes out that says, "Oh, it's going to do X, Y, Z," and I'm like, "Okay, the drug rep's very personable. I'm going to prescribe that to a few people." And those people come back in a few months and they're like, "Oh my God, my X, Y, Z is so much better." That's good, strong signal. I'm like, "Okay," and no side effects. Everything's good. You see that? That's signal. That's what I mean when I say that word. Back when I was recommending two people who were severely obese, who had type 2 diabetes, hypertension, metabolic syndrome, fatty liver, when I was recommending what is effectively a plant-based diet, they not whole food plant-based, not vegan, but predominantly plants, 70, 80, sometimes 90% plants, vegetarian, very heavily plant-based, and say, okay, you need to eat less, move more, join the gym, join Weight Watchers, stop the bacon, stop the saturated fat, and that's going to help you lose weight. And they would come back in, they had not lost any weight. And I'm not talking about one patient, so this is not anecdotal. I'm talking about thousands of patients because I practiced for 20 years full time. And so I would just not see the signal. And so I, for years, suspected these people of being fat and lazy and laying on the couch and eating Cheetos and not listening to me until I developed prediabetes and severe obesity. And then when I tried to adopt what I had been recommending for them, because I was definitely eating junk at that time, I adopted that predominantly plant-based diet, only the leanest meats, poultry and fish. It didn't help me at all. And that was kind of my epiphany, like, maybe my people have been listening to me. Now, on the contrary, when I started recommending a meat-heavy ketogenic diet to people with type 2 diabetes and severe obesity and metabolic syndrome and hypertension, I saw in 3 months, 6 months, immediate signal. Oh my God, I've lost 40 pounds. Oh my gosh, my A1C is down by three full percentage points. Oh my gosh, I can get in the pants that I got married in. That's not just one case, one patient. That's hundreds and hundreds of patients. That was how much stronger the signal was for a meat heavy keto diet versus a predominantly plant based, super low saturated fat diet. And so I'm just a dumb country boy. I just have to go by the signal. If I see signal coming back from my patients, then I go with that, because I would just ask Dr. Cohen, what's more dangerous for that actually increases somebody's risk of having a heart attack? Is it being a type 2 diabetic, or is it having high LDL cholesterol? Which one is more dangerous, and how much more dangerous is it? And I know Dr. Khan knows the answer to this, but many doctors do not know the answer to this. They'd be like, "Oh, well, high LDL is much more dangerous than having type 2 diabetes."
Okay. So, and would you really quick, let me ask, follow up on that. Do you foresee any long-term problems with being carnivore for a lifetime? I'm asking that because Dr. Khan, you and I have talked about this. Sure, there might be benefits in the short term. Sure, there might be things that are working 5 years, 10 years, but what does a lifetime look like? And this goes back to the cost. What is the cost of being carnivore?
Sure.
Have you seen anything like that, Dr. Berry? And then I'm going to ask you the same thing, Dr. Khan, but you first, Dr. Berry.
Yeah, so this is a great question, and this is a question everybody should ask, because everybody who's obese wants to lose weight. Everybody who's type 2 wants to reverse it. But what about 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years from now? And that's when I go back to the biological principle of adaptation, which applies without exception to every mammal that lives on planet Earth, including Homo sapiens sapien. And that is, we've been eating meat for over 2 million years. And so if you're going to come at me with the extraordinary claim of, oh, well, it might reverse type 2 diabetes and obesity and fatty liver, short term, but long term, it's going to kill you. That's an extraordinary claim. And so I'm going to need some compelling, damning evidence of that, or I'm going to have to go with the adaptation principle that applies to every other single thing in animal biology.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Khan, let's talk about the same thing. So if you have any kind of, just like Dr. Berry was saying, any numbers, in terms of data from people who have been carnivore and now have gone vegan. You were just sort of touching on that a little bit earlier, but do you have a lot of people that come in and, they're carnivore, now they go vegan? And let's say you do, what results are you seeing from those people?
Yeah. I don't attract a lot of carnivore patients. I welcome them. I have a few, but they know pretty much up front that they're not going to get yelled at, but they're also not going to get, supported as this is a breakthrough, and they're going to hear the full scientific spectrum of dietary, nutritional science, which is very robust and very favors whole food plant-based diets for body weight and blood sugar control and dementia reduction and mood reduction in terms of improvements, and certainly cardiovascular disease. Unlike Dr. Berry, I am a very busy cardiovascular specialist. My job is to prevent people having strokes, heart attacks, leg amputations. And, there's not even a debate that there's no carnivore data for reducing cardiovascular risk. And there are hundreds of well-done studies, not funded by industry, for whole food plant-based diets that continue on and on. The latest one was reversal of early cognitive impairment, published by Dr. Dean Ornish 8 weeks ago, with whole food plant-based diets and lifestyle. And just another extension of this switchblade called the whole food plant-based diet. What Dr. Berry and I both don't know, and this is the biggest problem with nutritional science, is he doing well on his meat-heavy diet? And I've done well for almost 5 decades on a zero meat diet, because something about my genetics, my microbiome is different than his microbiome. We know that.
Right.
But that's because of the food we eat. But is there something about the genetics? I mean, I think the blood type diet is largely considered fraudulent in most academic medical centers, but is there something more profound about our genetics that allows him to flourish? And again, we have this common thread. We're not eating processed food, with rare exception. We're not abusing processed sugar and white flour. We're emphasizing whole foods. And, I know this doesn't directly answer the question you asked, and I'll get there. But, the idea that there actually is an ancestral diet, and there's one, and it was very meat heavy, is very much in play. I mean, if you're an academic scientist and you publish in a journal called Nature, you've done something very good, probably the #1 most respected journal in the world. And just April 2024, they looked at a paleo community in Morocco that has a cemetery 15,000 years old. And they identified, based on isotopic analysis, that it was a very heavy plant-based diet. It was not consistent with what Lauren Cordain talks about, or others that were pioneers in the paleo and certainly keto diet. So the idea that we've been eating lots of meat for a long time is, I think, very much academically up in play. You just got to read the most recent literature and not just go with hearsay. So
Yeah.
but let me finish. Do I see patients? I mean, I don't think it's the most instructive comment. What do I see myself or in my clinic? Do I see patients that went off on a keto path? I mentioned one. Have I had 20 of them, 30 of them? Yeah, and their cholesterol went crazy, and one of them had a presentation of the emergency room and got a stent. He survived. That's described in the literature, people that adopted a low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diet and presented to emergency rooms and required stenting. It's not a robust area of literature, but it's in the medical literature, journals like Circulation. So, but in the world of cardiovascular disease prevention and reversal, it's entirely from a guy named Lester Morrison in Los Angeles, who published in the 1950s, to Nathan Pritikin in the 70s and 80s, 150 peer-reviewed papers, to Dr. Dean Ornish's 90 peer-reviewed papers, and Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn and Dr. Neil Barnard. We own the science for heart disease prevention and reversal. And the obligation is for, I love that Sean Baker is trying to raise money to do a good study, and that Dave Feldman is working with an academic cardiologist named Matthew Budoff at UCLA. But, until then, a physician and a patient, Joe, I want to help you, reduce your risk of a heart attack. To recommend a meat-heavy diet is not consistent with good counsel to that person.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Barry, you were going to
Yeah, I
comment on
was.
something there.
Dr. Kahn mentioned a paper recently published. I actually read that paper. It's the only paper in the anthropological literature that suggests that humans were eating a predominantly plant-based diet before 12,000 years ago, and the rest of the thousands of papers in the anthropological literature show very clearly that humans, from the time we evolved into Homo sapiens sapien about 300,000 years ago, we ate fatty meat, fish, if poultry. That was the predominant food that we ate. All of those tools that you hear about, Stone Age tools, those were not tools. Without exception, they were weapons. They were used to hunt animals, kill them, and cut them up so we could eat them. That's what those were. Those weren't tools, those were weapons. And so to say that, well, people around the world, and I actually agree with Dr. Kahn, I think genetics, and maybe gut microbiome matters a little, but I think genetics does matter. And that's why some people, when I say, hey, let's go low carb, lots of plants, lots of nuts, lots of berries, but you need some meat in there, they do great. It's typically people of Mediterranean descent, people of Asian descent. They do great on low carb, under 100 total grams of carbs a day. And it can be predominantly plant-based. But other people, and it seems to be the Nordic races, it seems to be people of very northern ancestry, that's just not going to cut it. It's still too high in carbs. Their A1C is going to be high. Their inflammatory markers are going to be high. But when you get them on an even lower carb, more animal-based diet, that's when all of their metabolic markers go back to normal. And so people need to understand that if you go, they're really everything that we think of as our heritage and our culture with regards to food is a modern invention. All of it comes after the agricultural devolution. If you look at the population of Homo sapiens sapiens before the agricultural devolution, we all ate lots of meat. There was no society that didn't eat lots of meat. The only societies that didn't eat lots of meat are the societies that couldn't get lots of meat. And then, of course, we would eat fallback foods. It's actually, they're called in the anthropological literature, fallback foods, poverty foods, starvation foods. Then we would start digging around for tubers. And definitely when the berries were ripe once a year, we ate the hell out of them, of course. But on a daily basis, in the middle of summer, in the middle of winter, we ate as much meat as we could get our hands on. This is inarguable based on the paleoanthropological and anthropological literature. Nobody debates that outside of just that one study. That I'm not going to try to poke holes in it. I'm actually proud that a fellow MD has read an anthropological paper, because that's a very rare occurrence. Most doctors don't ever read that.
Okay. Anything to say
I
to
will
that?
let you know, I wrote a very complimentary article, Everything I Love About Loren Cordain and his book, The Paleo Diet Edition 1, because he pointed out, he actually was very strong about saturated fat being a risk, for example. It was called, Is the Paleo Diet Healthy? 7 Things the Paleo Diet Gets Right. And it was based on Dr. Cordain's first book, the Paleo Diet. But he went and, altered his approach in his future editions of the book. But, cutting out crap is where we absolutely stand united, and where the message, of course, probably most people listening to this are clean eaters, and they're not eating a lot of donuts and frappuccinos and tombstone pizzas. But
Tombstone pizzas, I like that. So, okay.
I used to love them.
So that is going to bring me to my next question. I did want to ask a follow-up to what was just said. Just to, again, yes or no, briefly. Dr. Kahn, do you believe that humans, evolutionarily, we ate meat? Or do you believe that it was mostly plants? Yes to plants. How do I say this better? Do you believe people mostly ate plants evolutionarily?
I think plants were in the diet, and grains, much more than is taught by many paleo, keto, carnivore, researchers and physicians. Not only the study that both Dr. Berry and I read that comes out of Morocco. They just happen to have some very excellent preserved, cemetery findings to analyze. I know I was struck a few years ago by a researcher now at Harvard, Christina Warner. If anybody wants to watch a great YouTube, Debunking the Paleo Diet by Professor Warinner on YouTube. So there are other pockets there. I think it was a mixed diet, and it probably, varied by availability and season. It wasn't by restaurant menu, but
Okay.
that our ancestral diet demands meat. I mean, everybody agrees there were no, completely vegan communities in our background, but that's to deny that 2024 doesn't have special urgencies that 15,000 years ago had. We have pollution, and we have carbon emission, and we have greenhouse gases. And
But I'm not an expert in climate science, and I don't think you are either,
Yeah.
Dr. Kahn. So let's just stick to medicine and nutrition and not muddy the waters. Don't you agree?
A dirty planet is a medical issue. Air pollution is a medical issue.
Oh, I totally agree. I'm opposed to both.
Largely, it's also
Right.
microplastics and endocrine disruptors, which is that we don't have to talk about. But
Well, I think what he's getting at, what Dr. Berry's getting at, is your points are valid, very extremely valid, and they are very worth talking about. The conversation that I think is the most effective for the three of us to have is specifically about health of people eating the foods. And now what you're saying is microplastics find their way in a lot of our foods, right? And that's a lot of the problem. And that's why you adapt your diet today to adjust for that. Vegetables were good. Everything was fine. Substance-wise, it does sound like you're saying historically humans did include meat. That was part of their diet. And it does sound like what you're saying, Dr. Berry, is historically people did include vegetables. That was a part of their diet. It does sound like the two of you, where the difference is how much of each. And that's kind of, it could be the genetics, right? That really could be something. With that said, I want to move into this third question here. So let me read this. It was recently discovered that there was a 20-person expert group, which you guys probably know of. It's called the Dietary Guidelines for Americans Council, DGAC. And apparently, and unfortunately, 95% of that council had at least one undisclosed tie to big food or big pharma. So for anybody trying to understand why that matters, the purpose of this organization is to basically look at food recommendations from a science background and provide official recommendations to the government for food guidelines for the next 5 years. The most recent one was in 2020. The next one is going to be in 2025. So those guidelines are given to the American public to say, this is what makes you healthy. Those 20 people in that group have undisclosed ties, almost 100%, to big food, big pharma. I guess my question would be for you first, Dr. Kahn. Do you see these connections to big food or big pharma as a problem for people today? And why or why not? And if you think that affects the science at all?
Again, another commonality between Dr. Berry and I is we're both renegades. We're mavericks. I mean, he's not teaching standard family practice approach, and I'm not teaching standard cardiology approach. I'm a lifestyle-oriented nutrition, exercise, sleep, and stress management. Do I think that the pharma industry and the FDA and the DEA and the rest are completely corrupted by money and conflicts, and has it entered into food guidelines and recommendations? 100%. It's undisputable. I mean, the one thing we do know that's very embarrassing for the research in the Ancel Keys area was there's no doubt that a researcher named Dr. Hegestead at Harvard took the equivalent, I think, of in modern dollars of about $50,000 from the sugar industry to write an insanely complex article in the New England Journal of Medicine, which I've read, and I don't think I understood 30% of it. I don't think it made much difference in American culture, but that a prominent Harvard researcher accepted money from a lobby. Now, that wasn't Dr. Keys. They were colleagues, but they were at different institutions. I'm unaware of anybody ever proving that Dr. Ancel Keys ever took money from anybody to influence
Was
us.
was Dr. Keys aware of that?
No, this all came out maybe 7 years ago. So,
Okay.
and he had been dead probably 15 years. So,
Okay.
I don't know if he was, but it's certainly no reason to believe he was. But yes, I mean, it's horrible, and it goes way beyond nutrition. I mean, let's not bring up the vaccine program in this country and other aspects, but follow the money is pretty much a good way to track down a lot of what the American public is told to do, rather than follow your long-term optimal health. So,
yeah.
Yep.
Okay, and I'm going to ask you the same question, Dr. Berry.
Yeah. So the Dietary Guidelines Committee is absolutely corrupt. I totally agree with Dr. Kahn. I think the FDA is completely bought and paid for, with the revolving door of a CEO being at this corporation. Now he's at the FDA. Now he's at another. Of course, that's all egregious. Okay. But here's the thing so somehow Dr. Kahn, and with all due respect, because I love this man, I love the way his brain works. I'm often tweet him. How do you separate? How do you know, Dr. Kahn? Because you referenced earlier, there's 500 to 1 studies, plant-based versus carnivore, which is true currently, and then there's all these thousands of studies about a plant-based diet. How are you able to separate and say, well, yes, the Dietary Guidelines Committee, they're corrupt, the FDA is corrupt, my plate's corrupt, the food pyramid was corrupt, all that's corrupt, but these studies that show a possible association between a plant-based diet and health benefit, they're not corrupt at all. I don't know where the line is to say, oh, well, all these researchers are corrupt, but these researchers who happen to agree with what I agree with, they're not corrupt. That was one of the main things that made me start to question the entirety of modern nutrition research, is because you can't get funding. If I was a young researcher at Harvard or at Tufts or at Princeton, Yale, UCLA, and I went to my program director and said, hey, I've been reading about this carnivore diet and I want to do a study. I want to do a randomized controlled trial. I'm going to do metabolic ward. I've raised the money. I got an angel donator, got $50 million. I want to put people on a carnivore diet. First of all, the ethics committee probably wouldn't approve it. But even if they would, the program director would kick that young researcher out of the office and say, if you want to ever rise in this institution, I don't want to hear any of that kind of foolishness again, because you cannot scale up and make billions of dollars of profit from an animal-based diet. It just doesn't scale. Whereas if you come up with a pea protein or a soybean protein, you can make frankenfood with that all day long and make $1 billion a year. And then you can fund all of this vegan research with your profits. And then researchers are like, okay, I eat plant-based. You are obviously a plant-based company. You're giving me this research grant. I pretty much know what I need to find in this so that this study doesn't get file drawered, meaning it disappears and nobody ever sees it. If I want to do this research and then rise in the ranks of nutrition researchers, I better find a certain thing. I think that's ubiquitous in modern research. I'm sorry to say. I don't say that with any kind of pride. I say it with sadness, because it shouldn't be that way, but it's gotten to the point where you just can't trust modern nutrition research because of all the graft that Dr. Kahn said that he's very well aware of. I don't know where you draw the line between these are ethical nutrition studies and they're pristine and they haven't been touched by the influence of money or the promise of money. And how do you know which studies? Oh, these are definitely tainted by research dollars and therefore that came out in the results. I don't know where to draw that line. I think it's impossible to draw that line. And therefore, I pay very little attention to modern nutrition research, except for randomized controlled trials, which are very hard and very expensive. I'm well aware. But otherwise, I'm not interested in epidemiological research, because I know how easy it is for the researchers' preconceived notions to bleed into the results. Sometimes unconsciously. Sometimes it has nothing to do with money. It's just human nature.
What would you say to that, Dr. Kahn? Any thoughts on that?
Well, we can't throw away 30 million studies in the National Library of Medicine. And we can't just practice intuitively. In fact, that's not how medicine's going. Medicine's going where 30 million studies in the National Library of Medicine will be in an artificial intelligence apparatus, robot or laptop, and you're going to tell the robot your symptoms. And the research is going to dictate the workup and the treatment. And a lot of that's welcome because there's a lot of medical error. The first thing I do with every study is I go to the bottom and look at the funding. And you have to assume the funding's authentic or fabricated. But a study praising avocados funded by the Avocado Board may be a good study, but you pull back. This has been studied for egg consumption and cholesterol. Before 2010, most studies on eggs and cholesterol were not funded by industry. And there was a really ramping up by the Egg Board after 2010. Dr. Neil Barnard at Georgetown University published this in 2021. And there were very big differences in the relationship between egg consumption and blood cholesterol in studies funded by the Egg Board, not funded by the Egg Board, as one example. So yes, there's real challenges, but we have to go through and do our best. And if it's a clearly compromised study by obvious funding conflicts, it probably goes down a few notches in terms of reliability, but I think you still have to read it.
So you think it goes down a few notches, or do you think it just becomes crap? Because I think that if you can see obvious ulterior motives, it doesn't hold any validity whatsoever as meaningful research. You don't believe that?
I don't think you can completely discount it. Unfortunately, it's the same thing you said. Nutritional research is difficult. It's expensive. And sometimes the only way to get it done is, through, industry-based funding. And, in the pharmaceutical world, that's close to 100%. Nobody's funding pharmaceutical research, without pharmaceutical input. It's a big problem. We all know that.
Huge
and there's
problem.
there's no open access to the raw data that people that are smarter than me can actually go through it and see if it's true. That's a big problem too.
Huge problem. Yes, sir.
Yeah. And in the food industry, it's, less completely industry dominated, but, it's true. The avocado world, the egg world, the olive oil studies, and sugar studies are usually industry funded, but I don't think we can throw them all out and totally disregard them.
Something that I find interesting with that is when I think of Ancel Keys, right? Okay, maybe he was being completely honest about everything. You said his business partner was the gentleman that took the money, right, from the Sugar Association. Is that right?
Not his business partner, just another researcher in the world named Dr. Hegestedt. Yeah, Dr. Keys was at University of Minnesota.
Okay, so they weren't working together?
I don't think they published together. They both had an interest. There's a famous formula called the Keys formula and a famous formula called the Hegestedt formula, but probably they were more competitors in the academic world.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So everybody agrees here that the food system, the way that we are given information regarding health is corrupt. And that's been the way for a long time. What you two are trying to do is help people solve their problems through real whole food and not this frankenfood that we all talk about. Is it safe to say that we think the biggest enemy of all, whether it's meat or plants or whatever it is, the biggest enemy of all is ultra processed foods? Is that safe to say?
I'd agree.
Yeah, I totally agree. If the ultra processed food is full of sugar and grains and vegetable seed oils, then I completely agree. I don't agree, however, that bacon is a high ultra processed food. It's just sliced up meat. So don't be denigrating bacon, Dr. Kahn. It's sliced up meat.
If we were talking about cancer, we'd have that conversation. But yeah.
Well, we're actually going right there.
Ultra processed food is enemy number one. And again, maybe we need a part two. I mean, there clearly is a difference in the approach to whole grains. I would say the overwhelming majority of longevity science may be best pointed out by a study by something called the Global Burden of Disease study. It's only like 196 studies and tens of millions of people. Whole grains was one of the top 3 foods for longevity. And I know Dr. Berry chooses to avoid them and run from them, where, the Mediterranean diet is a whole grain diet, for example. But anyways, other than that aside, it's hyper processed foods, since the 1950s are killing us left and right.
Okay. This is my last question. Aware of everybody's time here. Do we have just 10 or so more minutes to dive into another question?
Sure.
Good, Dr. Berry?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Do you believe that red meat causes cancer? Why or why not? I'm asking that because I grew up believing that eating meat was really bad and could potentially cause cancer, was going to make me as a female unhealthy. The language taught to me was salads. And that was a big fear of mine for a long time until honestly pretty recently. So I'd like to hear probably from you first, Dr. Berry, about that red meat causing cancer, why that was said and what you think now, yes or no. And then same to you, Dr. Kahn, please.
Yeah, thank you. So first, let's go back to the biological principle of adaptation. Human beings have been eating as much fatty red meat as they could get their hands on for at least 2 million years. So to now say magically, starting in about the 1970s, that, oh my God, red meat causes cancer, so much so that the World Health Organization lists it as a possible carcinogen, is an extraordinary claim. So you better have compelling evidence. And I actually have links to all of the major research that Dr. Kahn and others would use to say, oh yes, this study suggests or shows an association between red meat and cancer. And if you actually look at those studies, the unprocessed red meat has a hazard ratio of 1.18. And if anybody knows about statistics or epidemiology, that's background noise. That literally doesn't, that's not even anything. A hazard ratio under 2 is irrelevant in the real world, especially with dirty studies that are using unreliable data like food frequency questionnaires. That's just bunk. That's worthless. Even for processed meat like bacon and salami and pastrami, the hazard ratio was 1.21. That's the best. That's what the World Health Organization listed meat as a possible carcinogen based on. There is no stronger evidence than that. You would think that they had some research like the epidemiologist who looked at cigarette smoking. And they said, we feel like this is causing lung cancer. Let's study this. Lo and behold, they came up with hazard ratios of 10, 20, 25, huge hazard ratios. So, yeah, it doesn't prove that smoking causes lung cancer, but it sure is suggestive. It's a very strong correlation. But a hazard ratio of 1.18, come on, that's foolishness. That's not even worth talking about. That shouldn't have even been published, much less made a big to-do about in the whole food plant-based community and then ultimately by the World Health Organization. There's no research on planet Earth, and I think Dr. Kahn will agree with this, there's no research on planet Earth that proves that red meat causes cancer or increases your risk of cancer. That research does not exist. All we have is epidemiological research that shows a possible weak association between red meat consumption and increased risk of cancer. But when you look at the food frequency questionnaires that they used, they would call things like pizza processed meat because it had some pepperoni on it. They would call something like a hamburger, including the bun and everything else on it, they would call that a serving of red meat. That's obviously any just common sense person would go, that's not just meat. That's a lot of grains. That's a lot of vegetable seed oils, probably some added sugar. How can you blame that on the meat? That's just ridiculous. And so anybody who really looks into the red meat causes cancer myth, they're going to be completely underwhelmed by the research that whole food plant-based people would use to try to scare people with. It's just foolishness.
And you include bacon in on that too.
Absolutely. I had 2 servings of bacon today for my breakfast at 2 p.m. because I fast as well.
Got you. Okay. Dr. Kahn, what are your thoughts?
I disagree. I don't think, again, Dr. Berry's quicker than I am to throw out, again, none of us, Dr. Berry and I, weren't born with a Bible from Mount Sinai that described nutritional science and its outcomes.
True.
It's difficult and it's challenging. My favorite nutritional researchers based on his academic status is Dr. Walter Longo at University of Southern California, probably the premier researcher on fasting and autophagy. And he talks about 5 pillars of nutrition. And really quickly, what's the data for red meat and cancer? Is there a reason to believe biochemically? We can talk, grilling meats, and we can talk about TMAO production. We can talk about 5-MeO-GC production. We can talk about inflammation. Is there a biochemical pathway? Are there randomized studies? Are there epidemiologic studies? Are there longevity studies? Do people in pockets of longevity eat lots and lots of red meat? Maybe they've eaten it for millions of years, but do they eat a lot? And then there's environmental issues. When you apply that and you apply the literature, I mean, just anybody goes September 2023 to a journal called Curious, Comprehensive Review of Red Meat Consumption and the Risk of Cancer. It's not just the World Health Association. It's dozens and dozens and dozens of studies, particularly colon, breast, and gastric cancer. And processed red meat, much more of a statistical issue than unprocessed red meat. And you're always going to find a contrary view, but I don't know that anybody's described that the World Health Organization had any skin in the game, any funding by the broccoli industry. They just looked at the literature. So it's imperfect science. 1.21 hazard ratio is a 21% increase in risk of cancer. And I agree. I think actually, Dr. Berry, I was listening to a YouTube by you today. If your lifetime risk of cancer goes from 5% to 6%, you might say, I'll take my risk and keep eating meat. But as a physician counseling a patient, we still have to say it is an increase. And, it needs to be a
possible increase, because it was based on epidemiological research, which doesn't prove anything. So you would have to say there's a possible 1% increase, right, doctor?
Or more. It depends which.
But you would have to say possible if you're going to be completely honest with your patient, right?
I would say the totality of the data and what's called the 5 pillars of nutritional longevity suggests there's a foundation for believing. And again, we're talking 2024. The fact that 95% of people eat factory farm meat, and antibiotic resistance and contamination. And all of us, Dr. Berry and I, and maybe you, Lauren, we're elite eaters. We spend more money. We buy high quality products. But that we're not speaking to the average American or average someone we say that. So anyways, I believe more than one.
I love what Dr. Kahn just said. But he keeps saying that the overwhelming consensus is the preponderance of the opinions from experts all around the world. A long time ago, back in Vienna, there was this doctor by the name of Semmelweis who he thought that doctors should probably wash their hands after they got finished dissecting a dead, rotten corpse before they went and delivered a woman's baby. And indeed, in the midwife hospital where they did wash their hands, they had like a 90% lower rate of childbirth fever where the moms usually died. Now, the preponderance of all expert consensus back then was that was foolishness. You don't need to wash your hands. No, doctors are gentlemen. They're never dirty, no matter if they've got dead carcass under their fingernails. Semmelweis was a renegade. He was a maverick. He said, you guys are all full of shit. You need to wash your hands after you handle dead human bodies before you could deliver newborn babies. He was made fun of. He was said, you're in the minority. Nobody believes what you believe. So I'll just say I'm happy to be in the Semmelweis position, to be a maverick and a renegade, and to point out that Dr. Kahn himself has said that the majority of nutrition research is compromised in one manner or another. Which part do you believe and which part do you not? So that's why I have decided to go back to first principles, the very oldest principle known to human science, which is adaptation. Species should continue to eat a diet that they've eaten for millions of years. And until I see compelling nutrition research, compelling with a hazard ratio higher than 1.21, that's still suggestive, but it does not prove anything, then I'm not interested in not eating an ancestral diet because some plant-based researchers at Tufts or Harvard School of Public Health have a preconceived notion, and their preconceived notion slipped into the results of their study, and it got published and picked up. And because they're so prominent, the World Health Organization jumped on board. I'm not interested in any of that until you have compelling evidence. I think we all should just eat what makes us feel best and get on with our life.
I think both, it would be, again, rather big ego for both Dr. Berry and myself to call ourselves junior Dr. Semmelweis, as I'm, very familiar with his biography, a famous Hungarian physician. I think he actually got completely moved out of the medical community, ended up becoming psychotic out of the depression, and died at a very young age.
Absolutely.
And I wish Dr. Berry much better than that. Me too.
But he was right, Dr. Kahn. But the predominance of the experts said he was crazy, and they drummed him out of the medical society, and he actually wound up in an insane asylum, got beat up, and he probably died from the infection from the same exact microbe that he was trying to protect these innocent mothers from, because arrogant doctors thought they knew best and they knew what consensus was, and they were not willing to look at any new ideas. And what I'm proposing is not even a new idea. It's the oldest idea on planet Earth. Cows should eat grass. Fish should swim in water. Humans should eat meat. Until you can prove otherwise with convincing research, I feel like that we can be friends, but we're probably going to disagree.
Can I ask Dr. Kahn, and I just genuinely want to know, because I want to be able to decipher studies better myself. How can you decipher the studies that are not compromised, like the dietary guidelines for American Council, that group of 20 people that advises the government has almost 100% undisclosed ties to big food and big pharma. They give the recommendations to basically America. So we can assume, we can pretty much know that it's not all completely transparent, and there might be some interests in there that might change that. So I'm asking you, what process do you go through to decipher the good science from the bad so that I can learn?
Yeah, I think on an individual level, I know a lot of people on the dietary guidelines boards. I've lectured with them, and some of them have corporate funding, but I believe I know their character. I'm not defending the dietary guidelines. I don't teach the dietary guidelines, right. But it is too common in academic medicine to have funding from conflicting sources, but yet I think a lot of people are honest at their core, and I would bring up Dr. Walter Willett, head of the School of Public Health at Harvard, as one of those who's been attacked and maligned at times. I wish he didn't take money from one of the seed oil companies. I'm blanking on the name, or at least the Harvard School of Public Health does it. It does. Right. It does dirty the whole reputation. Number two, I go back, and it's hard, but if you throw everything away, then you have really no cookbook to work with a patient with. I don't believe you throw everything away. I believe that we have decades of, when you have 200, 300, 400, 500 studies, you find themes, you find consistencies. And that's where I keep coming back to. Whole food plant-based diet, diabetic risk drops. Whole food plant-based diet, skin health. Whole food plant-based diet, cardiac health. Whole food plant-based diet, cancer risk. Whole food plant-based diet, optimal weight. There's a lot of junk vegans. We're not talking about that. We're talking about clean eating, just like Dr. Berry's teaching clean eating from a different source.
Right. Okay. So to wrap up the cancer piece is, obviously, Dr. Berry, you don't think cancer is caused by meat, given your position. Dr. Kahn, you do. Is your consensus on that based on reviewing people who have just eaten meat, carnivore, for like a long time? Or is your research from the studies that you've seen, or are you seeing a mixed bag of people who eat, some processed foods, some plants, some meat? My question, to summarize, is where are you getting that consensus? Is it just the data, or is it personal stuff too?
And you're addressing this to me?
Yes.
Okay. No, it's the data. I'm a cardiologist. I don't run a gastroenterology practice, right. But the biggest message for people listening is the awful rise in colorectal cancer and other pancreatic cancers, breast cancer in younger and younger people. And I think it's the same problem that Dr. Berry and I agree on. It's hyper-processed food. It's crap. It's additives and excess sugar, but it's also, microplastics, and it's endocrine disrupting chemical. It's the rise in obesity in the last 30, 40 years. So, yes, we should be incredibly focused on trying to prevent cancer in young people, for sure. It used to be a disease of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And now we're doing colonoscopy 5 years earlier, and I think the guidelines will end up moving to age 40. So, and prostate cancer, oh my God, in the African American community, crap environment and crap food. So, but yeah, it's the science. It's the hundreds of studies.
Gotcha. Okay. So in wrapping, is there anything that either one of you would like to end with as far as a question or a comment or anything that you just want to say to get out there as far as the science or an opinion or anything at all? This is what I'll say is I wish that both parties would try the opposite way of eating for a while just to see what happens. I think that would be interesting. Now, obviously, Dr. Khan, you do it for different reasons, just outside of health. So of course we respect that. But hypothetically, it would be interesting to see how that would go. I'll start with you, Dr. Berry. Any last comments that you'd like to mention or share? Or
Yeah, I think everybody watching this can tell that Dr. Khan is honest and earnest, and he believes in what he's doing. And I think he has nothing but the best of intentions for his patients. That's how every doctor should be. But I think that he just said earlier that we really don't really know which nutrition studies have been compromised and which have not. And so I don't know how you could base a practice on hundreds and hundreds of studies, but you don't know the percentage of them that have been compromised. That to me, I understand his point. I mean, why would you not listen to the guys at Harvard and Tufts? Of course, they're the smartest people in the world, right? Well, I don't know about that. I think sometimes renegades come from places you wouldn't expect with the right answer. And I think that may be what's going on here. I have great hope for Dr. Khan. I think he's a very rational person. And I think that if it were not for his religious prohibitions, he would wind up carnivore sometime within the next 3 to 5 years. But I understand he's made he has religious beliefs, and that's totally fine. But I have seen such an influx of people coming from a vegan diet into not just carnivore. Many of them do come to carnivore because many people go from one extreme to the other. But many people are like, look, this is not working for me. I'm having to take 14 supplements a day. I'm getting sicker. I'm weaker. I don't feel good. And then they add some meat back in, and it's like the light bulb goes off. They're like, oh, there you go. That's what I was missing. And it's not because they're gluttons. It's not because meat tastes so amazing. That's not what this is about. It's not because they're being selfish because they just missed the flavor of meat. It's because their health was suffering. And so I would like to ask Dr. Khan if do you believe there's a subset of humans who genetically will only reach their optimal health if they do include meat in their diet? Do you think that's possible, that there's a subset of people who just won't flourish unless they have at least some meat in their diet? Is that possible?
I think that's possible.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Berry. Dr. Khan, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
No, I enjoyed the conversation. I respect Dr. Berry. Keep teaching clean diets, and we can share a salad together.
Yes. I'll eat the avocado.
Right.
Me too.
No, I appreciate both of you. I think in the spirit of open conversation, having real conversation, not clickbait, there is absolutely no reason why people should throw so much hate towards vegans or plant-based diets. It's absolutely absurd. And I think, unless you're arguing for animal protection, which I do understand, there's no reason to shame people who are carnivore or meat-based. I think it's absurd. I think all parties should work together. The goal is the same. And I think everybody here can echo the same thing. Stop eating fake food. Pretty much everything that's packaged, for the most part, is not real food. And that is making you sick and anxious and fat. And that's the problem. So without, I guess we don't have anything else. If anybody else would like to ask any questions for our next conversation, please drop a comment below. I'll make sure to get Dr. Barry and Dr. Khan these questions, so maybe we do a follow-up. Please like, subscribe, share, and I will see you guys all on the next one.
Thank you.
Good to see
Right
you,
on.
Doctor.
I'm asking you just to do that, right? To just critique methodologically. Surely you're familiar with, like I said, the nurses' health professionals follow-up.
Like I said earlier, there are traditional methods of cooking and preparing these foods that detoxify them.
Like, why are you using that sort of terminology for really low-quality observational research when you're discounting some of the, the nurses' health professionals follow-up long-term RCTs?
Having a high plant-based index, you're not saying that you're vegetarian, vegan, but you're